In the humid twilight of the British Empire, there was no jewel more polished, no bastion more seemingly invulnerable than Singapore. It was the Gibraltar of the East, a testament to Victorian engineering and Edwardian confidence. A fortress that whispered of eternal dominance over the Pacific waves. To the planners in Whitehall, it was not merely a naval base, but a psychological anchor, a guarantee that the sun would never set on the Union Jack as long as these heavy guns stood watch over the Malacca Strait. But history is rarely kind to those who mistake a static monument for a living defense. The tragedy of Singapore was not born in the heat of 1942, but in the cold, complacent boardrooms of the 1920s. The British military establishment had built a strategy on a foundation of sand and echoes. They relied on the Singapore strategy, a plan that assumed the Royal Navy would simply dispatch a massive fleet from the Mediterranean if the Japanese ever dared to move south. It was a logistical fantasy that ignored the rising storm in Europe. When the threat finally materialized, the British found themselves caught in a trap of their own making. They had built a massive naval base without a fleet to occupy it, and they had installed massive coastal guns without the air power to protect them. The stage was set for a systemic collapse of monumental proportions. General Arthur Percival, the man who would inherit this looming disaster, was the quintessential staff officer. He was a man of intellect and order, but he lacked the ruthless charisma required to govern a crumbling front. As he looked out over the lush greenery of the Malaya Peninsula, he saw a landscape he believed to be impassable. The dense jungles and mangrove swamps were, in his mind, a natural fortification that no modern army could traverse with speed. It was a colonial arrogance that would prove fatal. Percival and his commanders viewed the Japanese not as a peer competitor, but as a secondary power, incapable of matching the technical sophistication of the West. Meanwhile, across the sea, General Tomoyuki Yamashita was preparing a masterclass in audacity, known as the Tiger of Malaya. Yamashita understood something the British had forgotten, that speed is often a more effective weapon than steel. He did not have the numbers, nor did he have the long-term supplies for a protracted siege. He was a man gambling with the clock, knowing that his only hope lay in a lightning strike that would shatter the British psyche before they could realize how thin his own lines were. He would not march through the jungle. He would flow through it. The first cracks in the fortress appeared not on land, but in the air and under the waves. On December 8, 1941, as the smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, the Japanese began their assault on Malaya. The British response was the dispatch of Force Z, centered around the modern battleship Prince of Wales and the Victorian battle cruiser Repulse. It was a show of force intended to intimidate the Japanese Navy. Instead, it became a funeral pyre for the age of the battleship. Without air cover, these behemoths were hunted down by Japanese land-based bombers. In a matter of hours, the pride of the Royal Navy lay at the bottom of the South China Sea. The message was clear. The era of naval supremacy without air superiority was over. The loss of Force Z sent a shockwave through the British command that they would never truly recover from. It wasn't just the loss of ships, it was the loss of the very concept of security. On the mainland, the Japanese were performing the impossible. They had seized thousands of bicycles from the local population, turning their infantry into a highly mobile force that bypassed British roadblocks by pedaling through narrow jungle paths. While the British stayed glued to the main roads, waiting for a conventional battle that would never come, the Japanese were constantly appearing in their rear, cutting communication lines and sowing chaos. The retreat became a rhythmic, soul-crushing cycle. The British, Indian, and Australian troops would dig in, wait for an attack, and then find themselves outflanked by Japanese soldiers who seem at home in the mud and the heat. The systemic failure of the British intelligence services was laid bare. They had underestimated the Japanese Zero fighter. They had underestimated Japanese light tanks, and most importantly, they had underestimated the sheer willpower of an army that was prepared to die for its emperor. Every time the British attempted to hold a line, the line dissolved under the pressure of a more agile foe. As the Japanese pushed further south, the tactical disasters began to mount. The British had failed to prepare any significant defenses on the northern shore of Singapore Island itself. Percival, fearing that a visible line of trenches would hurt civilian morale, had forbidden the construction of fixed fortifications. It was a staggering oversight. He believed the battle would be won in the jungles of Malaya, and when that battle was lost, he found himself standing on an island that was a fortress in name only. The legendary 15-inch guns are guns designed to repel a naval invasion, could not be effectively turned to fire on the Japanese positions in the north because they lacked the necessary high-explosive ammunition for land targets. The psychological toll on the defending troops was immense. The Australian 8th Division, under the command of the controversial Gordon Bennett, found themselves thrust into the front line of a collapsing theater. There were moments of incredible bravery, but they were often overshadowed by a lack of coordination and a growing sense of abandonment. The soldiers felt like pawns in a game being played by leaders, who were thousands of miles away and decades behind the reality of modern war. The water supply for the entire island was now at risk as the reservoirs fell into the hands of the advancing Japanese. By the time the Japanese reached the Johor Strait, the physical barrier separating Singapore from the mainland, the British were exhausted. Yamashita, despite his overwhelming momentum, was actually running out of ammunition and food. He was bluffing on a grand scale. He launched a series of feints that convinced Percival the main attack would come from the northeast, while the actual assault was prepared for the northwest. On the night of February 8, 1942, the Japanese crossed the water in collapsible boats. The defense of the beaches was sporadic and disorganized. The Gibraltar of the East was being breached by men in rowboats and on bicycles. In the midst of this systemic collapse, there were flashes of individual brilliance and sacrifice that history often forgets. On the ridges of Pasir Panjang, the Malay regiment stood their ground against impossible odds. Led by Lieutenant Adnan Saidi, they fought a desperate hand-to-hand struggle against the Japanese 18th Division. They were not fighting for a distant king or an abstract empire. They were fighting for their homes, even when their ammunition was gone. They refused to surrender, engaging in bayonet charges until they were overwhelmed. Their sacrifice was a stark contrast to the indecision at the highest levels of command. But individual heroism could not mend a broken system. By February 15th, the situation was untenable. The city was crowded with over 1 million civilians. The water pipes had been shattered by constant shelling, and the smell of death hung heavy in the tropical air. Percival faced a choice that no commander ever wants to make. He could fight to the last man in the streets of Singapore, leading to a slaughter of unimaginable proportions, or he could accept the humiliation of surrender. In the boardroom of the Ford Motor Factory, the two men met, the tall, gaunt Percival and the short, aggressive Yamashita. The negotiation was brief and brutal. Yamashita, sensing Percival's hesitation, pounded the table and demanded a simple yes or no to his terms. He knew that if the British didn't surrender now, his own bluff might be called. Percival, broken by the weight of the disaster, signed the document. It was the largest surrender in the history of the British military. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops were marched into a captivity from which many would never return. The myth of European superiority in Asia had been shattered in 70 days. The aftermath was a descent into a darkness that the people of Singapore could never have imagined. The Suk Ching massacre began almost immediately as the Japanese military sought to eliminate anti-Japanese elements within the Chinese community. Thousands of young men were rounded up, driven to the beaches, and executed. The fall of Singapore was not just a military defeat, it was a human catastrophe. The POWs were sent to Changi prison and later to the horrific labor camps of the Burma Railway, where the tropical climate and the brutality of their captors turned the survivors into ghosts of their former selves. The historical irony of Singapore is that the very magnitude of the defeat ensured that the world would never be the same again. It was the moment the British Empire truly died, even if it would take another 2 decades for the funeral to be official. The peoples of Southeast Asia had seen the invincible masters defeated and humiliated, and the seeds of independence movements were sown in the blood-stained soil of 1942. The fortress had failed because it was built for a world that no longer existed, defended by men who were looking at the horizon while the enemy was already at their gates. When we look back at the ruins of that era, we see a cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional inertia. Singapore fell because of a failure of imagination. It fell because the British believed their own propaganda, forgetting that a fortress is only as strong as the strategy that supports it. The tragic conclusion of the campaign was not just the loss of an island, but the loss of a worldview. The sun had finally set, and in the long shadow that followed, a new and more turbulent world was being born. As the smoke cleared over the Padang and the rising sun flag flew, where the Union Jack once stood, the lesson was etched into the stones of the city. Power is not a permanent inheritance. It is a temporary lease that must be renewed through constant adaptation and humility. The fall of Singapore remains a haunting reminder that even the mightiest walls can be bypassed by those who understand the changing winds of time. It was the greatest defeat in British history, a moment of profound darkness that would eventually lead to the dawn of a new post-colonial age forged in the fires of a war that spared no one.
The jewel of the East, a fortress of pride, with guns facing out to the turning of tide. the fortress was hollow, a monument built on a bedrock of arrogance, silence, and guilt. Whitehall was dreaming of fleets in the bay, while the tiger was hunting in the heat of the day. The bicycles pedaled through mangroves and mud, the path of the phantom, a river of blood. They ignored all the warnings, the signs on the wall, waiting for battles that never would call. Oh, Singapore, the Gibraltar of ghosts, betrayed by the leaders, the pride of the coast. The guns were all silent, the sun hit the ground, while the empire crumbled without a true sound. The 80,000 marching to the dark of the tree, the day the sun set on the heart of the sea. Force Z is a grave on the floor of the deep, where the secrets of naval supremacy sleep. Adnan was fighting with bayonet steel, while the generals faltered and lost every wheel. The water ran dry, the city turned gray, the pride of the masters was washed all away. In the Ford factory room, the surrender is signed. The map of the world has been forever redefined. Yamashita's gamble, a bluff won by flame, leaving the history in ashes and shame. The Sock King is coming, the shadows grow long, the end of the story, a funeral song. Of pain.